believe it or not, that's actually me in that picture, 30 years ago. And I was at Emory University at the time. And I had been given the job of teaching marketing research to our students. And prior to doing my PhD, I had actually been a brand manager for 3 years back in India. And as part of my brand management, one thing I learned is that market research is not something you can really do just sitting behind a desk. You got to go out, you got to talk to people and collect data and stuff like that. So when I got the task of teaching this course, both to grads and undergrads, I said, what's the point of doing fictitious research projects for the alumni office or, the career office and all of this? Why don't we do projects for nonprofits who don't have the money to commission kind of market research themselves? So I started this program, and we did projects for kind of 30 nonprofits in the Atlanta, nonprofits and social cause organizations, I should say, in the Atlanta area, the Red Cross, the Cancer Society, and so on. And that's really, in doing that, that's where I really got my first breaks into kind of doing academic research. So one of the projects I procured for my students was on behalf of the High Museum of Art. So this, what you see here, is the premier art museum in Atlanta, and it's called the High Museum of Art. And the director there said, kind of, okay, do a survey of our visitors and try to figure out kind of what are their intentions of joining the museum as members. And so the students kind of did some kind of survey. But in talking to the director, it turned out that their main problem, the reason she was looking for more members, is that their main problem is that they keep losing members all the time. So churn is pretty high in the museum. So I thought that was kind of an interesting question. So why is churn high? And why do members keep leaving? Well, for that, you have to understand, what do members care for? Why do they come, or why are they members in the first place? And in doing that research, so I treated that as an academic research question, membership in cultural organizations and what really drives member retention. And it turns out that the most important aspect of a membership is kind of the social identity that one derives from being a member. So I am a supporter of the arts, right? I am able to speak about the museum in social settings, and I'm proud that I'm a member of the art museum, and all of these kinds of things basically came out. And so my first paper, if you will, in an A journal, so to speak, was about the art museum and kind of what is this bond of identification. So identification is the sense of belongingness between the member and the organization, kind of what drives that sense of identification. Now, some of you might recognize these two names, Huggy Rao, who's like in the organizational behavior area at Stanford, and Mary Ann Glynn, who used to be very much here at Boston College. And they're the ones who gave me the first break, and they were kind enough to let me be first author on the paper, but I literally just learned the ropes of research kind of from them. And once this got done, then the question was, okay, well, this is a weird kind of a cultural organization, membership, this, that. Do consumers actually identify with brands? Is that possible? Because all the work on identification so far had been done with employees and their organizations where they worked, right? And so here you have, this is your sense of identification. So you get a tattoo somewhere on your body, or however you want to display your affiliation. And with my colleague Shankar Sen, who has partnered on a lot of projects, we published this paper also in the Journal of Marketing to show the conditions or the factors that help build this sense of belongingness between a consumer and a company. You don't have to be a member or anything like that, So it could be Harley Davidson, it could be Patagonia, it could be any of these organizations that have a distinctive identity. So we kind of build this was a conceptual paper. And that was 1995, and this is 2003. So you can see that we move fairly slowly from, research moves slowly. But that was not the only factor that this got pushed to 2003. In the meantime, whilst I was doing my course, market research course, I met this gentleman. His name is Ben Cohen. He just actually left Ben & Jerry's. He used to be the CEO of Ben & Jerry's. Oh, hi, Shirley. Used to be the CEO of Ben & Jerry's. And so I met him one evening when I forced myself to go to a conference, an evening reception of a conference. So not feeling like it, well, let's just go. And there I met him and we started talking, and I told him I'm doing this thing with my students. Is there any question that comes to your mind that we could help you with? So he said, yes, there is something, so we do things for the environment. So there's a happy cow. So Cherry Garcia, your favorite flavor, I'm sure. Happy cow playing the guitar. And so we support the rainforest. He said, can you help me understand, do consumers reward firms for their social responsibility? So when they buy ice cream, all else equal, would they buy Ben & Jerry's, because of our social and environmental performance? I said, well, immediately that sounded like quite a difficult question for students to answer. But I found that question very intriguing because he was talking about sales, which is, as a marketing academic, we were all thinking, how do you increase sales? But he was talking about social and environmental attributes as drivers of sales. And nobody at that time was thinking about those factors as driving sales. Everybody was thinking about price, product, promotion, the standard 4 Ps. So we got to work. So this is what is the whole paradigm of doing well by doing good. So the question he's asking is, so when you create social environmental value, can I drive business value that way? So this is like a Harvard Business School type 2x2. Do not get fixated on where is the origin and what's the zero, and so this is just 4 quadrants essentially. And all I'm saying is that the question he was asking in plain English is kind of, does this upper right-hand quadrant exist, where we're not only just chasing profit, but we're also integrating people concerns and planetary concerns kind of into our decision making. And if we are, then we can sustain ourselves as a species. So we call it sustainable business. Strategic corporate responsibility, it goes, there are 100 names that you can probably find for this quadrant. But does it actually exist? Do consumers reward companies for their social responsibility activities? And so with my colleague Shankar Sen, we published this paper in 2001. Does doing good always lead to doing better? Consumer reactions to corporate social responsibility. And the answer to this question, of course, is it depends. Like any good MBA answer, to any question, right? Yeah, it depends on consumer characteristics, industry characteristics, competitive characteristics. All of that stuff. And so, as it turns out, this was one of the first papers following on the work of. So one person who cited extensively in my work is Sandra Waddock. So all respect here. But this was, in the marketing literature, this was kind of a new contribution. And so this actually happens to be also my most cited paper. It has more than 8,000 citations. And now it's come back full circle because I've been invited to update this kind of, what does it look like in 2025? What work has been done in this area in the last. So I'll come back to that. So I'll finish with this as well at the end of my talk. So of course, you can do good for the sake of doing good, and that's actually corporate responsibility. But if you want to be strategic about it, so this is also related to this idea of instrumental stakeholder theory, kind of, okay, so we are not like doing this just for the sake of doing good, but we also want to derive something from kind of our actions here. So this was now, so 2001, and so 2002, I think I got tenure at Boston University. So by then I moved from Emory to Boston University, dual career issue. My wife was actually a professor at Boston College for 12 years that we lived in Boston. And I was always, because I guess maybe because of my brand management background, always interested in managers and interfacing with managers. I mean, what's the academic managerial interface? So I tried to sell them this idea, like, look, let's have a conference to kind of shore up interest in this area. And so in conversation, it turned out that London Business School, my friend Craig Smith, who used to be at London Business School, was having conversations with David Vogel at UC Berkeley, also to host similar kinds of conferences. So we kind of triangulated our interests. And I approached the Aspen Institute for some money and the Marketing and Science Institute for some money to be able to do this. And it took, so there were 300 people, BU, they have that auditorium. It was absolutely full. Sandra was one of our esteemed speakers at that conference. And Sandra comes up in the afternoon, after lunch, and she says, okay, before I start, why doesn't everybody get up and stretch? So here we have 300 people in the room. They all stand up and they're all doing like, going up and like touching their toes and this and that. And she woke the crowd up before she started her talk. So that's the first time I saw that kind of interesting inspiration coming from a speaker. But the reason I say this is that this led to yet another interesting path opening up for me. So the Marketing Science Institute sent out invitations to their member companies. And one of the member companies that showed up was P&G in the conference. And this guy from P&G comes up to me and says, we actually want to get some research done. So I have solicited proposals from 3 or 4 university centers, and he said, would you like to write a proposal? We have another 2 weeks before we close the process. I said, yeah, sure, I'd like to write a proposal. I mean, so he sends me the RFP, and in 2 weeks I cobble something together and I send it back to him. And then, he reviews that and he calls me and he says, yeah, it looks interesting. And he said, you know what? 2 other schools, like Boston College, Center for Corporate Citizenship, and Berkeley, the Center for Responsible Business at Haas, they basically wrote in their proposal that if they get the job, they're going to work with you. So why don't we just work with you directly instead of kind of going through them? I said, well, it sounds fine to me. So we progressed, the conversation progressed, and then we set a date where I would go to Cincinnati and basically sign the papers, and then the project would start. But God had, I guess, the Almighty had other ideas in his or her mind. And on November 20th, 2003, I met with an accident. So I was struck by a car as a pedestrian, and my life was basically upended. But I got unconscious, so I'm in this ambulance, and at some point I come to and thinking, I have no idea where I am, St. Peter, I'll see somebody, welcome to heaven or something. And so where am I? I said, oh, you had an accident, you're in an ambulance. Okay. And then they quickly asked me kind of, what's your name, what's your phone number, to see if my memory is working. And it was. So the fourth or the fifth question I asked them is like, can I go to Cincinnati next week? I have an important meeting with P&G, and these guys, I think, are trained to keep you calm. So they said, yeah, it's no problem. Little did I know that I'd have to have 6 surgeries on my legs and, be a lifelong chronic pain patient. and now this is the slide that we actually made our holiday card that year. So in the hospital, you know who that is. So I had no idea. So P&G, so no Cincinnati. So what happened was Cincinnati came to the hospital. So the P&G folks came to the hospital, and we had a conference room, and we sat around and we signed papers, and so that was another momentous occasion, I guess, in my life that I can never forget. And one of the projects that P&G entrusted us with was something to do with this program that they had called Crest Healthy Smiles. And Crest Healthy Smiles is a program where P&G would go into the inner cities in the United States, where mostly immigrant populations from South America, Hispanic-speaking population, and they were so poor that they could not afford toothbrushes for every member of the family. So they would be sharing toothbrushes, and obviously they wouldn't be going to dentists and this and that. P&G wanted to know if this program was making any difference, both socially, and they had a strategic objective because Colgate is the stronger brand in the in South America, in Hispanic countries. So they wanted to make strategic inroads into this market that was steadfastly kind of Colgate. So I said, okay, you got to study. And this is not an easy population to study because most of them are illegal. They don't want to give their phone number. They don't want to share their address, this, that. But we got groups together, and we did a focus group and focus groups in plural, which were held in Spanish with simultaneous translation. And then we did a survey or a quasi-experiment to compare those who had been through the program with those who are aware of the program, and with those, a control group that actually was not even aware of the program, etc. And here I have to give a shout out to the other wonderful person in this room right now, my ex-doctoral student, I should say, and now full professor at the University of New Hampshire, Shui Li, who produced 2 fine publications, one in the Journal of Consumer Research and one in Management Science, where we actually showed that people who were kind of going to the program were benefiting greatly from it, not just in functional terms, which is you're brushing your teeth and flossing your teeth, etc., but also in psychosocial terms. So they had more self-esteem. The children were smiling more. They were more confident. They were making more friends. So this amazing portfolio of benefits. And they said that, of course, we want to buy this company's products because that's the only way this program will keep on going and more people will keep benefiting, etc. We got a total of 4 publications out of that P&G project, and the other 2 publications was with my other doctoral student, Daniel Korshun, who unfortunately passed away at a very young age. But all this knowledge, essentially, all this knowledge from these various projects, I also worked with General Mills, Timberland, a variety of companies, so it's produced a book in leveraging corporate responsibility, focusing on this stakeholder route, kind of how do stakeholders reward under what conditions do stakeholders reward companies for their CSR initiatives. And this book was co-authored also with, like I said, my other doctoral student around that time, Daniel Korshun. Now, as I was writing this book, and as I did this research, one thing that I learned was that to get the rewards of CSR, to get the rewards of CSR, a company has to be strategic. Like just doing something, mere engagement is not enough. I mean, then nobody's going to come to you and buy a product. But if they find value in what you're doing, kind of if it's of usefulness to them, if you have distinctiveness in your program, so there are all these conditions. But when I went to these companies, including P&G, the person who I dealt with was not in the C-suite, was not connected to the C-suite. So they were like doing things on their own, and the big brass were doing things. And this disconnect was struck me as very bad for the overall future of CSR, because in the meantime the world has kept moving. You have climate change, plastics in the ocean, water running out, inequality growing, and then in the global south, 20% of the world still doesn't have electricity. I mean, this is something to think about, right? Indoor pollution, which is also becoming in the US a very, very big source of harm. There are 65 million girls across the world, who are out of school, and so we've got to be schooling them. And as we were pondering all of this, we got hit by COVID, when the world literally stopped for some months. And the reason I put this is my own doing, and that's my own doing. I replaced some of the pictures with these two. And the reason I did that is to show that all of these problems are man-made problems. God did not create any of them. And they got created by basically the pursuit of profits, kind of profits at all costs. And so everybody trying to maximize their bottom line without thinking about the common good. And this is a phenomenon which is called the tragedy of the commons, right? So global warming is a great example of tragedy of the commons, right? Everybody trying to maximize their own satisfaction, their own well-being, but that leads to this kind of loss for everyone, and we have rising temperatures. So by now it becomes clear that sustainability is essentially our license to operate. That if we do not integrate, and by now the language has moved to sustainability, and by now I have moved to Berlin from Boston as well. And so I said, okay, I mean, everybody does sustainability, but they do it at different levels of sophistication, if you will. Most of the firms are just compliant. They just obey what the rules say. You cannot dump effluents into the waterways. Okay, fine, the ISO 14001 or whatever that is. So we won't do anything that's outside of the law. Got it. Then there is a group of companies who say, well, it's not enough to be compliant. We must reduce. Sustainability is a way to reduce risk. If I kind of fortify my mind, or if I build a cooling center so that the people who are working in the fields can actually come and cool off, then my productivity is not going to be hampered, or sickness. I mean, they're not going to fall sick. So reduces risk for my business. Okay, that's why I invest in sustainability. The risk reduction argument goes over very well with finance people, that sustainability is a way to reduce risk. Then the marketing people come in and they say, well, I mean, it's not just that, not just compliance and risk reduction, but it's also opportunity generation. So people want green products. So we've got to make green products for them. And kind of, so Siemens, for example, 25% of their revenue is from their green product lines. There's green paint. I don't know how many of you know that. So you can buy, there are different kinds of paint which don't have specific chemicals. So yeah, people care about that stuff. But very, very few companies are at the pinnacle of that pyramid where they conduct business through the lens of sustainability. And what do I mean by that? I mean by that is like every business decision from the mailroom to the boardroom is done or undertaken with the environment in mind and with society in mind, kind of the well-being of the people and the planet in mind. So that's kind of, if that happens, then we can make much faster progress towards our goals. Then it's not siloed, then it's not one department or anything anymore. So why shouldn't everybody get there, right? So I'm getting ahead of myself. So why shouldn't everybody get there? Yes, of course.
Just because this is fabulous. I've also spent, sustainable development. And some of those are conflict with each other. So
Yes.
So
Poverty and I think in our paper we were talking about. You can ask Linda and Dorgana the question.
Look at the top of the pyramid. There is an agreement on what that means. And it could be, say, what my version of well-being is going to be, it's somebody else.
Right.
So I'm just curious. I'm just curious as to what that means in practice. Assume there's a
Well, we have to send her our paper. We just finished the paper we submitted that he was talking about. We need to tackle this very question.
Oh,
No poverty, conflicts with responsible consumption and climate action. Because if you keep talking about the poverty, their ecological footprint will increase. So
Yeah.
this will offer, interventions that might reduce that potential.
okay, great. So I'm sorry, it just seemed like that's
And we want to,
almost explicit, if what you're not quite explicit, but.
I think the point is, yeah, my apologies. But the point is that this is not a zero-sum game. It's not a zero-sum game, and we want to exploit the power and. So if you kind of go to Ed Freeman and talk to him, he said there is no kind of conflict. There might be conflicts in the short run, but if we are strategic about it, then we should be able to maybe one more to a greater extent, one to a lesser extent, and so on and so forth. But it's not kind of something. That's a huge limiting factor. And maybe some of that comes from purpose, which I will introduce very soon as a key construct, if you will, in the journey, right? So why shouldn't every company be there at the pinnacle of this pyramid? It's because sustainability is viewed as someone else's problem in most companies, even today. So I wrote this maybe 10 years ago, but even today, it's like siloed and not kind of embedded in the entire organization. But there are some companies where I did research and it is everyone's problem. And one example I will give is that of of Unilever. They have this brand of tea called PG Tips, which they make in a factory in the UK. Now, it so turned out that a factory employee, shop floor employee, figured out that you could cut off 3 millimeters from the paper bag that covers the tea bag and not lose any performance, of the tea bag. So he brought up this idea to the manager on the factory floor, who bubbled it higher up. Ultimately, this plan got implemented and they started taking off using 3 millimeters less on those paper bags of the tea. And you might think 3 millimeters, what's the big deal? But if you multiply that 3 millimeters by the volume of tea bags that Unilever makes, it ended up in like a significant savings of paper. And if you save paper, what do you also save at the same time? Money, right? So you're saving money and contributing directly to your bottom line. So there's a business outcome and a social outcome, right? So then I tried to kind of, okay, how can every company be like this, where people can bring up ideas get bubbled up and then kind of, get implemented. So how do we engage the entire workforce in sustainability? And that leads to my last book, which is Small Actions, Big Difference, where I interviewed, well over 100 like CEOs, C-suite, factory workers, middle management, all these kinds of people all across the globe. And one telling quote, is like, make sustainability everyone's job. If there is one exception, then everybody thinks they are the exception. So like no exceptions, everybody's a sustainability manager in the company. I mean, that's the idea. I do hope that, you're all taking pictures and going to buy copies of the book. I'm not seeing too many cameras out. But what's the essence of the book? And I will just leave you with the key idea. The key idea is ownership. There's a literature in the management field that's called psychological ownership, which says that people can feel a sense of ownership, even if you don't own something legally, it's not a physical object. You can own an idea as well, like sustainability. Okay, yeah, I have ownership over sustainability in my company. Jean-Paul Sartre said something like, ownership is important because it's part of the human condition. We are what we have. And then Russ Belk and others in marketing essentially extended this or came up with this concept of the extended self, that your possessions, what you have and what you show to the rest of the world that you have, that's essentially an extension of who you are. I mean, it's possessions and the extended self. So I thought, okay, ownership may be an interesting construct. And the way I thought about ownership was, again, directly from the field. I was in a very, very hot town in India where Unilever has a factory, and it's a water-stressed area. And the employees of the factory, about 6 or 8 of them, gathered around me, and they were excitedly showing me what they had done to figure out how to harvest rainwater for production purposes, And one guy said, I even did this at home. And my wife is so happy because now we can do our laundry and we can wash our pots and pans, and wonderful. So, but looking at the pride that they took in explaining this to me, that's the word that came to my mind, ownership. Oh, they've taken ownership of the problem and done something about it. So I said, well, let me look if there's something in the area of ownership. I actually didn't know. And I found, lo and behold, there's a huge literature. I mean, there's quite a big literature on psychological ownership. Well, okay, this could be something. And the reason ownership works well is that it fulfills 3 fundamental drives. The drive for efficacy, identity, and belonging. And what do these mean? Efficacy is basically each of us want to feel that we are in control of our environments. Like, if I can put off the light in this room as I walk out, then I'm in control of that environment. If I can actually start my car in the morning doing something, so in sustainability, everybody can do something. You can print 2-sided, right? You can carpool, or you can do simple things, so everybody has a chance to contribute. The second thing is identity. So the thing that's missing today in the job sphere, if you look at Gallup polls and stuff, is job meaning. There is no job meaning, right? Why do we work? Well, just to make money. But that's not gonna, ultimately, that's not a very powerful identity or reason to work. So if you work for a company that is sustainable or works on sustainability, you can latch on to that part and say, hey, I work for a sustainable company, or someone that's doing something that adds to your identity. And finally, this sense of belonging is like getting personal meaning, sense of security, comfort in our surroundings. Man is a gregarious animal. And on the home front or the community front, so if you're working on climate change, for example, through your work, saying, well, I'm doing something for my children, so that they don't have to suffer the adverse consequences that much. So it looked like ownership was a reasonable construct for me to hang my hat on. And so I kind of noodled with that, and I came up with something that's called sustainability ownership model. And that's essentially, so each of these factors that, or phases rather, essentially tell you the factors that companies need to implement in order to make their businesses or their organizations sustainable, in the sense of kind of empowering all their employees to act in the sustainability domain. And I'll take just like a minute for each factor to give you a sense of what it was doing, what I did. So the first step is that I was telling you the purpose. So purpose is the North Star. So if you don't have a purpose of an organization, if you think it's profit maximization, you still think it's profit maximization, don't you? That we will, so we have organizations because we want to create value. We want to create value. So I remind my students that business started with barter. Right? So you have some rice, I have a goat, I give you half my goat, you give me half your rice, and both of us can have a good meal, right? Someone else comes along and say, oh, I can stitch clothes, then it becomes like a three-way thing, and on and on and on. That's how it started, right? So at some point, profit became but if I didn't get value, if I'm a vegetarian, I might actually say, no, it's not going to work with you. I don't have any value for your goat. So value creation is the purpose of business, and profit is the consequence of value creation. Now, this is a very, very hard message to give to our MBA students, that what we want to do is to try to maximize the value that we offer to the stakeholder. So the purpose, the literal definition is, why do we do what we do? Why do we do what we do? Not what do we do or what do we want to do, which is mission and vision, but why do we do what we do? So why do we make automobiles? Is it to sell cars, or is it to provide mobility, right? So every question has to answer this question kind of for themselves. Every organization has to answer this question for themselves. And this story from Enel. So Enel is a very large electric utility company, and its CEO sitting in Rome is telling me this story that says, I was a middle manager in the desert a long time back, and we were building a power plant in the desert, in the middle of the Sahara Desert. And he said, I could see the trucks coming down the hill with fuel to kind of, power the plant. And there were transmission lines as well going out of the plant, but with no load to feed. I didn't know where they were going, where these transmission lines were actually going, what's happening, what's going to happen. So he said, I did some digging and I found that this was a dubious piece of social engineering. And the idea was that they would build air-conditioned tents in the middle of the desert where the nomads and the Bedouins would come during their travel, and they would plonk themselves inside these air-conditioned tents and watch TV. That was the plan. And he said, but these guys were not asking for air-conditioned tents in the middle of the desert. We were trying to foist new habits on people. And he said, that's when I understood that the purpose of an electricity company is not to foist new habits. It's essentially to help them, enable them to do what they want to do. And he said that was the kind of the epiphany that I had about kind of what is the purpose of an electricity company. So similarly, you can inspire epiphanies amongst your managers and kind of, senior leadership so that they actually understand what the value is that they're providing to the world. Then you define what's material for your business, kind of, everybody doesn't have to run after carbon. There's lots of different things that one can do depending on your business. Then once you have incubated the purpose, the idea is to launch it to your workforce, whether it's 5 people, 10 people, 100,000 people. Now, how do you launch? How do you tell someone, look, you are in sales, but now your job is also to do the green thing? They'll say, get the hell out. I have no time. So that's when the persuasion part comes in, kind of, okay, so, and what we found, or I, because this was a solo authored project, I found was that kind of appeals to the head and appeals to the heart. These are the two most effective things. One is, hey, do you know that if you can save some material in your production, you'll make more money? Works very well with the finance folks. They're right on board. Okay, let's save some materials. But you go to some other folks and who are not that much, kind of don't think about money all the time. It's just, hey, what are your children going to do? If we don't combat climate change now, what's the next generation gonna look like? So that's the appeal to the head. And oftentimes it's hybrid. It's like a mix of both the head and the heart appeal. So you got to somehow convince them, and what Apple told me, the environmental director of Apple said, yeah, the most fun part of my job is to actually go in and talk to them about the money. And that's the part that people really, really seem to understand, that by saving materials, you can save money, right? Okay? But creating willingness is not enough. You've got to create ability. And there comes this whole thing of training, right? You've got to train your workforce. Good companies have compulsory onboarding sustainability training for a week, and ongoing training. Management systems. So I learned this from Marks and Spencer's. Guy says, you want to build a new store in Dubai? He said, it will happen at the push of a button. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Everything will be made to the latest sustainability specification. You don't have to do anything. We've done it for you. You just push the button. It's going to happen. So same thing with, I don't know what it is in BC, is whether the default printing is one-sided or two-sided. When I went to Pitt, the default printing was one-sided, So I asked IT people, isn't it possible to kind of change it to two-sided? Yeah, it is possible. So please change it. And after that, whatever the default is, that's what people do. But nobody actually goes and changes that, to make it harder on yourself. So what you need to do is all these steps basically lower the costs of acting sustainably. But at the same time, you want to increase the benefits. What does it mean to increase the benefits? Promotions, raises, tying incentives, tying bonuses to sustainability performance. So ultimately, the idea is, okay, you've got to make it everybody's job. And then it's the cultural piece, which is called entrenched. The entrenched means routinized. So just like when I see a car in front of me, I want to press the brake. Here, whenever I see an opportunity to act sustainably, I will. And how do we get to that stage? Well, you've got to communicate progress, co-create solutions with your employees, celebrate successes. And this is Marks and Spencer, another company I studied quite closely. And they have annual parties that are like Oscar-style red carpet parties, where they bring the entire workforce of the company, could be virtually, but in London physically. And they would call out a single employee as kind of the star, okay, you've gone over, and that could be somebody who works in a retail store, which is wonderful for the whole organization to see, and it's energizing and so on. And the last step of that entrenching is essentially to expand this sense. So there's also a literature on collective ownership, individual ownership, and then collective ownership. Well, it's all our planet. It's not just, my planet. So the idea that competitors would collaborate with each other to solve these difficult problems of the tragedy of the commons, like deforestation. That's the example I have up here. Like you cut down trees to build. Okay, and that's happening. So in fact, companies have pledged that their palm oil will be sustainable and not subject to deforestation by 2030. That was a pledge made last year. So what does all of this put together mean? I mean, let me just give you two anecdotes or two quotes from my book, from my interviews. Here is a chief sustainability officer of a retail organization, of a very large retail organization, who says, some of the great leaps and breakthroughs with sustainability have happened because people across the organization have been inspired to change things themselves without coming to me to ask permission to talk through the details. They know their part of the business better than me. So 100,000 people, if they had to come to the chief sustainability officer to take permission, stuff wouldn't happen. But if they have that sense of ownership and they're inspired to change things themselves, then progress can be much faster. And here's a director of a beverage company who says, an employee who decides that he can make changes to a valve that will save energy or save water, an employee who decides to do something differently with the way water flows through a line or our electricity use, add all those up, you get a very big difference. So that is the essence of small actions, big difference. We're not asking anyone by themselves to save the world, but we're asking everybody to do what they can in their sphere of influence. And if you do what you can in the sphere of influence, then collectively it will bubble up and we can make a bigger impact. Well, the book is of course anecdotal. I mean, it's managerial and all of that. How do we test some of these ideas in the book? And so the main idea is this, just look at the first link, that's the main thing. It's like, does purpose, when employees perceive a sense of purpose, do they get this sense of ownership, kind of, okay, this is mine? And does that trigger them, does that drive them to engage in more sustainable behaviors? And so we show this kind of, through, this is a company that my friend was the CEO. In India, he allowed us to survey his employees, and we were able to show this link. But of course, as you know, these days it's not enough. Surveys don't cut it anymore. You've got to do some experiments. And so we had an experiment where we set up kinds of what we call low purpose and high purpose. So one is profit maximization, and one is kind of providing nourishment to the world. I mean, it was a food company kind of a setting. And we show that when it's the higher purpose, then you have a higher sense of ownership and you engage in more sustainable behaviors. And then we add in autonomy as a moderator, and then moral identity centrality, which is like an individual difference variable. But the idea is this, that if your employees perceive that, because purpose is a perception, it's nothing objective. But if your employees perceive that you have a purpose that's kind of, to nourish, to provide mobility, to do this, to do that, not just kind of make money, then that sustainability ownership does seem to kick in, and you do engage more in sustainable behaviors. And so there's more work going on kind of in this stream as well. And so I wanted to check, okay, so we're talking so much about purpose. What's the sense of purpose in industry? I mean, so I was lucky enough to connect with the managing director of Harris Poll, and we did a survey of employees, a random survey of employees in the United States. And according to the employees, only 30% of the companies have any sense of purpose that goes beyond profit maximization. Just about a third of companies, right? And so this created a bit of a stir amongst people who read it. And I got interviewed by Fortune, the Fortune magazine, and the reporter, I didn't know she would come up with such a brash title, but the employees say corporate claims of ESG are baloney, according to a new survey. And well, I had to go into hiding quickly. It's like, who is this guy? So yeah, we are not doing well. I mean, it's very sad. And after January 20th, I'm sure this number probably might be in the 20s now. Who knows? I don't know. But the purpose is an exciting concept. And so one of the papers, follow-up papers I've done, again, to go back to my interdisciplinary kind of interest in research, I teamed up with Leon Valdez, who's in operations, Trevor Young-Hyman in organizational behavior, Oliver Hall is an organizational psychologist, Evan is a doctoral student. And what we wanted to do in this paper, so this paper is forthcoming at Management Science, which is a good thing at my age, I guess, right? The idea is, how do people who are not insiders, right? Employees are insiders. I mean, they get to see exactly what you're doing and they have full information. But what about people who are going to apply for jobs to your company? applicants, potential applicants. And in the job advertisement, you provide a company description that has some elements of purpose kind of thrown in. How do they kind of, treat that purpose because they don't really know what's going on the other side? I mean, they're only reading the advertisement and then they're going to apply for the job. So can we figure out, does purpose play a role in this setting? So what we did was basically 3 studies, but I will just show briefly 2 of them, and one experiment and one secondary data study, if you will. Now, the setting is that kind of, it's the University of Pittsburgh, and they, so there's data on postings and applications. So the huge dashboard kind of job applications come and people apply. So we have a bunch of job applications, postings, and we know exactly how many students applied to which job, right? And so 20,000 jobs, 5,000 firms, so fairly large numbers. And our task is really to derive a measure of purpose based on those job advertisements. So how do you extract from that data just words, right? So this is like large language modeling. Julie, maybe you know something about this because I don't, but essentially it's a cluster analysis, if you will. So you throw in all these job advertisements, and the program looks at kind of, the common occurrences of words kind of in them. And using those common occurrences, so it comes up with different topics. So topic modeling. So we came up with 70 topics, and one of them we identified as purpose, right? So this is just one example of a high purpose firm. Together with the global medical community, we are using collective intelligence and machine learning to map any health problem to its possible diagnosis. We are building a deeply mission-oriented team that is passionate about improving the cost of access to effectiveness of healthcare globally. So we have something that we want to contribute to the bigger good. So that's the idea about it's not just about us, it's about the greater good, right? That's purpose. So we come up with a measure of purpose, quantitative measure. And what we find is that when we cut that across firm size, and this was hypothesized, what we find very interestingly is that larger firms seem to get a bigger boost from having purpose language in their ads than smaller firms. So what's happening? Well, larger firms have more capacity to, so it's not just willingness, but it's also ability. They have the ability to execute, implement on that purpose claim. Maybe that's what's going on. Well, is it? Well, okay, we can see this. We saw the same thing in the regression, which I won't show. But then we went on to do an experiment where we said, okay, 2 different sizes of firms, one small firm, one big firm, so calling it low capacity, high capacity. And another firm, so this was forced onto us by the reviewers, but said, well, capacity doesn't only happen by size. There are other ways you can get capacity. So one of the ways we thought about was kind of, okay, affiliation with another prestigious kind of institution, maybe that gives you capacity. So it's a small firm, but Redwood Associates developed out of a collaboration between Harvard, the United Nations World Food Program, and Nestle. So, okay, but I'm a small firm, but I have believers in me who are big, and they can, provide me the necessary capacity to implement my ideas. So what we find is, compared to the small firm condition, both the large firm and the small plus spin out, they benefit more from kind of, the purpose claim. So essentially what's happening is that the underlying mediator is authenticity. So they believe the purpose claim more when they believe that the firm is capable of executing on its purpose. And when if they believe that, well, I mean, these are just words, unlikely to end in anything, that dampens the application likelihood. So the application likelihood is the dependent variable kind of, in this case. So this paper took about, I want to say 4 to 5 years to get published in management science. Now, the other interest, all tied to the bigger field of sustainability, that brought me closer to Gargana was this roundtable that I was asked to put together at this conference called the Society for Consumer Psychology. And I have always had an interest in figuring out, how do we get consumers to consume less? It's like the big problem with climate change is that we consume way beyond our means, right? We consume way beyond our means. Our carbon footprints, particularly in the US, are way higher than the average footprint in the world, right? And that is causing a lot of consternation for us. So how do we get people to buy less as opposed to buying more, which is something we learned in our PhD programs, that purchase variable, the purchase intention, how do we boost purchase intention? And now I'm thinking about how do we dampen purchase intention, kind of, So we put together this roundtable. These were the people. They are kind of, many of these names are in marketing at least, who's who, are well known for their work. And Gargana was one of them who came out and talked about her excellent work in the field of recycling. But once this roundtable, it was a 1-hour roundtable. That 1 hour came and went. I tried keeping notes, and we said, well, there's enough in here to at least get the word out, via publication. So we published this paper. All of us collectively, we gave our thoughts: enhancing consumer and planetary well-being by consuming less, consuming better. Consuming better means buying the sustainable option if you have some options. So I want to continue working in this area, and one of my dreams, if you will, is to actually be able to build a model and test it that shows the antecedents and the mediators that lead to consuming less, to show that purchase intention can actually go down. I think that would be an interesting contribution to the field of marketing. So that's one thing that's going on. And then comes this paper from 2001, which we had done, and we had done something fairly clumsy, I think, looking back 20 years. So we had, some some product quality information from consumers, some CSR initiative, and we came up with a mediator at that time, which we call consumer company congruence, and then our outcome variables were this company evaluation, purchase intentions. And then I get this call from Dhruv Grewal, who's editing a special issue of the Journal of the Academy of Marketing Science, saying, can you update this article to reflect what's happened in the last 20 plus years? Well, can I? I don't know. So this is the updated model, and I don't expect you to read this, each of these variables. But yeah, there's been a ton of work, So the question was, how do we cut down the 8,000 articles to something more manageable? And we did basically a bibliometric analysis, kind of just looked at FT50, and then we looked at the relevance of the articles, et cetera. And then we did a cluster analysis. And the cluster analysis basically showed that the articles fell into one of 3 kind of categories that we labeled: understanding, kind of, are people aware? What do they attribute this CSR initiative to, et cetera? Do they derive the utility? Remember, I told you about the P&G example where they had functional and psychosocial utility. Do they derive the utility from there? That was bunch. And then unity, remember, I told you about identification. So it actually kind of, the articles fell nicely into these three categories. And we delved into these articles basically to come up with that model. And then there were some key findings, but you can have the article anytime you want. I just wanted to end with my most favorite project of the moment, which is joint work with Gargana, with Linda, and with a bunch of other people. And I just got this invitation out of the blue from Gargana saying, do you want to come to DC? We are going to be holed up in a room for 2 days and we have to develop a paper. I said, that doesn't sound like me at all. I mean, I don't want to be holed up anywhere let alone for 2 days, but well, I did. And I found it to be a joyous experience, a really joyous experience. So the idea behind this paper or this project that we started was kind of, how do we get the people, the poorer people who are the most financially vulnerable, and consequently, they're also the most climate vulnerable as well, because they live in these poorer locations that are close to coastal areas or flood. The risks of environmental damage is more. They don't have surplus money to be able to get medicines, to be able to do this. So how do we uplift? I think the title, all credit goes to these two. How do we uplift the impoverished without actually overheating the planet? What that means is that any kind of upliftment, financial upliftment, means that you're going to spend more on products, and spending more on products means rising CO2. So how do we kind of get them to follow a sustainable path once they're financially, or along with their financial empowerment? How do we get them to follow a sustainable path rather than falling into the old trap of kind of consuming. And simultaneously, how do we cut the consumption of those, like I said, are consuming way beyond their means? So it's a two-pronged problem. And this was the kind of the conceptual model we came up with. And the main contribution of the paper is kind of, what can we do in terms of mitigation interventions and adaptation interventions? So mitigation is kind of reducing immediate harm, whereas adaptation is kind of, preparing for the next disaster that's kind of going to come our way. And we talk about the micro, or rather, I should say it in the other order, the macro, which is the policy, the meso, which is the organizational level, and then the micro, which is kind of the individual consumer level. What can they do? What can these three groups of stakeholders kind of do to solve this issue? Very, very complicated issue, because this climate-induced harm, it can be not just financial harm, it can be social harm, it can be financial, social, what other kinds of health harm, that's one of the big ones. And so we just submitted this paper to the Journal of Public Policy and Marketing after 4 months over the summer. So we'll see kind of what happens. But I was telling Linda last night that something that interests me a lot is to understand the link between this, or empirically understand the link between this consumer financial vulnerability and the climate vulnerability. So if you can actually calibrate this relationship so that kind of, how much increase or decrease in financial vulnerability leads to increases or decreases in climate vulnerability, I mean, that would be also a pretty nice contribution, and something that I look forward to pursuing in the future. So I think I'm kind of have 20 minutes, or how long does this go till?
20 minutes.
20 minutes left, right? So which I want to just have a discussion with all of you. I want to leave you with this thought, at least for those of you who have children. I like this saying very much. We don't inherit the earth from our parents. We borrow it from our children. And if we leave the earth in a worse place than what we found, I mean, which all signs show to that's what's going to happen, it's not a good thing. All right, I'll stop here. Thank you very much for your attention. And happy to, the question doesn't have to be addressed to me, we can all face each other and chat, and I shall sit down. You can talk about your own research, it's fine. Anything goes.
Can I start?
Yes, of course you can.
Since you pointed at me, for finance several times. It didn't sound to me that in any of what you said, in fact, I think a lot of your research would suggest that, profits or making money at the end of the day is not a bad outcome. But the way that you get there can mean that you make more profits or less profits. In particular, if you have more purpose, if you deliver this purpose, if you give ownership to people in these changes and the business is built in a particular way, you can actually make the path to develop more profits, not less.
Absolutely.
And so it's not in conflict. There's not a trade-off here necessarily. It's just the way that you think about your business and that you think about conducting your business can actually deliver more profits if you do it.
Absolutely, and that's the message that I want to leave you with. I mean, this is not at all it might be in conflict with the time horizon, because from quarter to quarter, which is why companies are moving away from reporting
Short-term.
Unilever moved away from reporting quarterly profit. They said we cannot be sustainable or think about sustainability if we have to report quarterly profits. So they moved away from that. But during that time horizon of 10 years, Unilever outperformed all its competitors kind of at that time, right? So absolutely important message that it's not sustainability and profitability. It's not, or it's also an and, basically, and more, in fact, because there are two ways sustainability creates value. I didn't have time to get into this, but it's the direct route and the indirect route. So the direct route is basically, so if you cut emissions, you cut costs, right? But the indirect route is, what do my employees think about the fact that I'm using renewable energy? That's the stakeholder route. So when all of that comes together, then yeah, I mean, you stand to make more money. It's just a way of running a business, which is why I say there's nothing different about sustainability than, a different mindset of the different way of running a business and outshining your competitors or your rivals, what have you.